Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM or on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. Tonight on the program, we will have the continuation of our interview with Representative Chris Rabb. In the second half of the program, Denise and I will discuss where we are in the mayoral race. And the Denise I'm speaking of course, is our own Denise Clay Murray. Denise, how are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. People say that when it comes to local government in the summertime, there really isn't a lot happening, but that has not been the case certainly this year, and really for the last couple of years, honestly.
Well, no, because we have this issue with gun violence that we're dealing with, and because of that, it's kind of forced the political class here in Philly to do something that it might not have done regularly, which is, hold press conferences and talk about things. But this year in particular, especially with the midterm elections after Labor Day and some other things coming up, we also have the mayor's race coming up. And, make no mistake, the mayor may still have another year in office. Mayor Kenny may still have another year in office. But the mayor's race actually started during the last city council session.
That's right.
Probably in the not too distant future, maybe starting with the September meetings, you're going to start seeing people resign from office because under the city charter, you have to resign the office you're currently in order to run for another office that's a city office, meaning that if you're a member of city council and you want to run for mayor, you have to resign. And the reason why the city charter does this is because it believes that if you are running for mayor while continuing to work in city council, you are basically trying to pass laws that you may have to uphold, and it's seen as a conflict of interest. So you would have to resign to run. Now, if you're a state legislature, if you're one of the people who's in our state house or state senate, and you decide you want to run for mayor, you don't have to resign your office. You can run for both offices concurrently. So far, I haven't heard of anyone who might want to do that. But considering the last two election cycles, State Senator Anthony Hardy Williams has been on the ballot. Don't be surprised if you see him this time.
Yep. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we're going to talk about that in the second half of the show. But before we get to that, we are going to have our interview with Representative Chris Rabb. Rabb, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so the first thing I'd like to ask you about, the Commonwealth passed its budget a couple weeks ago. Can you walk us through how this budget can and will benefit Philadelphians?
Sure. With every budget, state budget, there are good things and bad things. And what's interesting as a legislator is, I think much in life, you can justify supporting or opposing things because it's so full of so many things. You can say, I'm supporting it because it has all these great things, despite all these awful things. You can also say, despite all these wonderful things, I'm opposing this measure or this budget or this bill because of the things that I strongly oppose. And so, yet again, we have a hodgepodge. And that's really indicative of the legislative process and the negotiating process between House Democrats and Republicans, the House and the Senate, and ultimately with the governor. So there's really 5 stakeholders, formal stakeholders, plus the general public across the Commonwealth. And so as a rank and file member, I am not a part of any of those negotiations. And in fact, this is the 6th budget where I find out essentially, the key components of that budget literally hours before voting for it. So it is often the case that I find out things that are in the budget from journalists and lobbyists before I figure it out myself, because these bills are so massive and so many things get shoved in the under the cloak of darkness. So all of that is a preamble to say that the things that I like that were put in the budget clearly relate to increased funding for Philadelphia public schools. It's a historic investment in public schools, and yet nearly enough. It's a lot, given that I work in a chamber and in a legislature that doesn't really support public school at all. So the fact that we were able to get, I believe, I forget the exact amount, but well over $100 million coming to Philadelphia schools is saying something relative to my experiences in my first 3 terms. But it's something that we certainly can use immediately, and we desperately need more money. Of course, that's going to be up to voters in November and in each successive election with regard to the type of people they want to send to Harrisburg who will actually support full and fair funding of public education.
And you said something there that is concerning, though, regarding process. And we do like to talk about process. But when you get the budget just before you're supposed to vote on it, you can make the argument the budget's the most important vote you could take that year, because it's highlighting all the different priorities that the government's taking. Why is it that way? And is there any way to change that?
So the last question is the easiest to answer, and that is yes, we can change it. That requires the political will of the general population, voters and non-voters, people who have chosen not to vote or who cannot vote, either because they're not old enough or they're not eligible to vote or they have not found a reason to register in the first place, to say, I don't like how we're getting stuff done with our taxpayer dollars, because even children and non-voters pay taxes. Unless and until they understand that the way we've done it for decades and generations is not particularly democratic or good for the Commonwealth, then this will continue. And there are many things that have happened behind closed doors that once people discover is happening behind closed doors, they say, this shouldn't happen behind closed doors. But that's why independent media outlets like yours and others have so much work to do to raise the level of awareness and transparency around how things currently happen, and then leave it to the public to decide, is this good? Is this appropriate? Does this move us forward as a Commonwealth, as a city, as a society? And we can see that that's happened in the aftermath of the nonviolent protests stemming from the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. People were seeing the importance of police accountability when they discovered so many things were happening unbeknownst to them that were negatively impacting community safety, black and brown people in particular. And that's when they said, okay, we need to have greater transparency and accountability in law enforcement. And that echoed in Harrisburg, and me and a handful of other black legislators literally shut down, the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and demanded immediate legislative action on police accountability. And 36 days later, Governor Wolf signs 2 Democratic bills into law with unanimous support in the House and the Senate. That happened because people exercised their First Amendment rights, protested in 66 of 67 counties, and I don't know the one county where there weren't any documented protests, but that's saying a lot. In Pennsylvania, where only 14% of the population is black, and there were all-white protests against racial violence and racial injustice, and we were able to get something done that had never been done before, create a police misconduct database, which was just in the news because a local law enforcement agency and township refused to follow the law and didn't do a background check, and it indirectly allowed for a child killer to get offered a job in a small town in Pennsylvania, and then he had to resign when the people found out what happened.
That's right.
All of this is to say that if once people realize what the process is and they see how hierarchical and inefficient and inequitable it is, and what that means in terms of how that may hurt the ability of legislators to do what they want them to do, something will change. But unless and until that knowledge is gained, it will continue on.
Where do you think the Commonwealth needs to make more investment in terms of anti-poverty funding and anti-violence funding?
Great questions. Well, on the anti-poverty front, like we have a serious housing crisis. We have a housing crisis among those folks who are homeowners who can barely afford the cost of home ownership, folks on fixed incomes who have homes in great disrepair. And then you have folks who are renters who can't afford the rent. And then you have folks who want to be first-time home buyers who can't afford it. This is an issue, and the irony is in Harrisburg, there's no housing committee. When I got elected in 2016, I took office in 2017, I wanted to be on the housing committee, and they're like, there is no housing committee. Like, that is a basic, like, food, shelter, clothing, shelter. There's no housing committee, which speaks volumes about the priorities of the folks who have run Harrisburg for the past 30 years, and those are my Republican counterparts. And while I don't particularly see myself as a partisan, the facts are the facts. Republicans have run Harrisburg for the vast majority of the past 30 years due to gerrymandering, and as a result, the infrastructure of Harrisburg and how it operates is I was saying that the operational architecture of Harrisburg is influenced by those folks who have been in the multi-generational majority of the House and the Senate. And so what we're able to do has a lot to do with the very rules and culture of Harrisburg. That is what I was thrust into when I was elected. And as a result, who gets on what committees? What are the committees? Who runs those committees? What bills are even considered that address the concerns of a majority, irrespective of political party, of Pennsylvanians? All that is decided by the people who run the one party in control. So garbage in, garbage out. You have to look at the architecture of how things get done. You can do the same thing for City Hall. You can do the same thing for Congress. But for those of us who live in Philly or anywhere else across the Commonwealth, on a state level, you have to understand kind of the math and politics of that institution. And that institution has been very anti-Philadelphia for a long time.
That's right. I'd like to bring Denise Clay Murray here on Philadelphia Hall Monitor.
Hi, and thank you for joining us, Representative Rabb. I kind of wanted to ask a couple of questions about some amendments that came down the pike as part of the budget process. Particularly amendments that there were three that seemed to stand out. One was, of course, the amendment on abortion rights, but the other two regarded voting.
Are you referring to the late night resolution passed by Republican senators to get a ballot question to amend the state constitution to do a number of things, inclusive of the things you just mentioned?
Yes.
Okay, so that would be a vote on the prospective amendment of the state constitution, but what was put forth in terms of a vote were not amendments, they were a vote on a resolution to amend the state constitution. Yes.
First of all, what is the difference between the two things for those of us who may not know that there's a difference? And secondly, when you were presented with these things, what did you think, especially in light of the fact that the budget itself had either not been passed or had just been passed that day?
I thought this is just another day in Harrisburg. This is, if people had any idea just how that's crazy, and that's a quote, the norm is the toxic work environment in which legislators are sent, particularly legislators who do not have the benefit of being in the majority, which is what controls the legislative agenda. I don't mean that in any other sense other than practically speaking. Only the majority can decide what bills are run. So that is the norm. They have been putting up anti-repro justice bills for the past 3 terms that I've been in office. They have put up anti-trans bills, anti-immigrant bills, anti-black bills. This is the norm. So there's nothing that they can do that will surprise me. My only hope is that for the folks who are not already focused or angry enough about this because they have found out about this one way or the other, that if this is new information that is enraging, that people will positively convert that rage into collective action when it matters most. And it's not just during election season, because that's important. Voting is important, but not everyone can vote. And oftentimes, when people do vote, there's only one name on the ballot. So our democracy has to transcend the election cycle. We also have to protest. We have to demand change. And people say, oh, well, these marches don't work. There's no evidence that marches don't work. And I can prove that because as a black person, many of the things that I have now would not have happened if they were not for nonviolent protests for generations that led to actual concrete legislation. And I also referenced it previously in my own work, helping lead a protest that led to a historic change in how we view law enforcement as codified in state law by creating a police misconduct database. So I think that this extreme resolution that would seek to amend the state constitution to essentially ban abortion and to reinstate voter ID and other things is emblematic of the true priorities of my Republican colleagues, because this is what they do all year long. They were trying to find a moment with less scrutiny, past 11 o'clock, which was a rule that was changed years ago to avoid this very thing, where legislators couldn't pass something late at night and people wouldn't find out. That it literally caused a sea change in representation in Harrisburg when a number of people didn't get reelected because they voted for a pay raise for themselves, in the wee hours, hoping that it wouldn't catch a lot of people's attention, and it ultimately backfired on them. And that's exactly what Republicans did 2 weeks ago. And it's part of a larger plan. But this plan is not particularly secret because this has been their legislative priority for years.
So if I'm a voter in Pennsylvania and I'm listening to this process go on, what can I do as a voter to make it so these things don't pass? What kind of information should I be looking for?
Well, here's the thing. If you're in Philadelphia, there wasn't a single Philadelphia legislator that supported it. So this is bigger than voting, because the one person who was part of this is a state senator named Doug Mastriano, and he's running for governor. So if you're a Philadelphia voter and you don't like the process by which it happened, you don't like the end result of this motion being made for a resolution that would amend the Constitution in the most brutal ways, then you should definitely figure out who is the gubernatorial candidate, who is in most alignment with your values. Now, there's no perfect candidate. There's no perfect party. There's no perfect campaign. But if this is a concern of yours, if reproductive justice is a concern of yours, well, then, it should be a pretty easy decision. Now, I'm using a government phone, so I can't really get into candidates, campaigns, endorsements, etc. But I can say that on that issue, the two gubernatorial candidates could not be further apart. But it doesn't matter what you feel; it matters how you express that feeling at the ballot box. And most people who are adults who are of voting age don't actually vote. But they need the information. They also need to understand the process. Normally, they just find out the results. But if they understand that it's garbage in, garbage out, and that the whole system is deeply problematic, then they can ask themselves, well, who are the folks who actually want to talk about root causes and systemic change? And then they can figure out who among the political party they identify with are folks who are committed to that and who are less inclined to talk about systemic change. But the day after the Dobbs decision came out, and I'm sure you know this, at City Hall, 5,000 to 10,000 people came out, many of whom were young folks. I imagine some were even too young to vote. They were mad as hell. The following day, Democrats organized something, and 100 people showed up about the same issue, just 24 hours later. This issue transcends campaigns, elections, candidates, and political parties. And more legislators need to understand that, because there weren't that many elected officials, very few, who actually showed up when the 5,000 people showed up. And perhaps more elected officials need to have their ear closer to the ground to understand the complicated feelings that voters and non-voters alike have around these important issues that you raised.
Okay. So, Larry, do you have any additional questions?
Yeah, I just have two that are kind of Philadelphia-centric, but also kind of the first one ties with Harrisburg. We've seen House Republicans begin this nascent impeachment process against District Attorney Larry Krasner. Particularly strange because he was just reelected with over 80% of the vote in the city. But where do you come down on this? What are your thoughts on this process? And is this just a political ploy?
It is absolutely a political ploy, part out of desperation, part out of a deep disregard for Philadelphians. These are folks who talk about liberty and justice for all. They stand for the Pledge of Allegiance every day. They talk about the First Amendment. They talk about voting. They talk about all these things. But somehow, when the vast majority of voters double down and choose to reelect their district attorney, that's immaterial. That's irrelevant. They're not saying that it was voter fraud and that he wasn't actually reelected by a wide margin. They just don't care. Now, part of that, they don't have the courage to say out loud, which is, we don't trust black people because there's a black plurality in the city. And ultimately, they don't trust or care for the collective opinions and concerns of black people. They're not going to say that because they don't want to look racist. But the reality is their policy priorities and their policy proposals are racist. And that's something that I prefer people in hoods, because you know where they stand. And they'll say what they mean and mean what they say. You know who you're dealing with. For folks who like to play politics in this day and age, They like to do gaslight and dog whistle and use buzzwords. For anyone who's been around, and I'm 52, there's nothing new under the sun, and it's not particularly subtle. But no one wants to be called a racist, even folks who do racist things. And this is an indictment of democracy. It's an indictment of or the anti-democratic feelings of folks who don't really want democracy. That's not really what they're promoting. They're promoting the freedom to do whatever the hell they want because they have the power to do so. And we give them the power when we don't organize. We give them the power when we don't vote as consistently or as intentionally as we should. And when we don't push back against racist, misogynistic, xenophobic, transphobic, homophobic things that are on their agenda every single day. So we have a part to play in the success of their efforts. And when we are silent, when we equivocate, they win. But there's no good reason for this. When I spoke on the House floor, I said, we already have a legislative body that holds the district attorney's office and every other elected official to account, and that's the city council. We have a committee on public safety that can hold the district attorney to account if indeed the people of Philadelphia feel that he is not doing what he should do in his office. And Larry Krasner is not universally loved. There is no elected official I know of ever that is universally loved. And there are people who have strong opinions on different parts of the work that he does, his office does. And if there was a concern, that concern can be brought up by the appropriate legislative body. They want to create a select committee of non-Philadelphians, non-black people, non-Republicans, or non-Democrats to decide what's the priority for investigations for a Philadelphia-specific position. And that is about as anti-democratic as I can imagine.
Right, and you brought up City Council. So after the Parkway incident on the 4th of July, City Council held a press conference in council chambers, and the term "stop and frisk" came up. What was your reaction when you heard that, and what do you think is meant by that?
I mean, what do I think about stop and frisk, or what do I think about the intentions of people who brought it up?
I guess both, because it was mentioned, and it to me, and this is the word I kept using over and over again that week. Everything that happened that week was just odd, and I think it was an odd thing that it was sort of brought up, and I was just wondering what you thought when you heard that, and if that's something that is worth exploring. Is it something to be dismissed out of hand?
No, I mean, I am adamantly opposed to stop and frisk. I am a black man in a racist society. I would be subject to stop and frisk if I weren't wearing a suit, maybe even wearing a suit. Mm-hmm. But if I'm wearing a hoodie, there's a good chance I'm going to be stopped, and I could be stopped with force. I could be stopped, and it could be psychologically traumatizing to me, as it is to the vast majority of largely black men and boys. I mean, it is the discretion of law enforcement to decide who they stop and frisk. And law enforcement has not earned the trust of black people to decide who is worthy of stopping and frisking and who is not. I represent Chestnut Hill, which is one of the richest neighborhoods in the entire state. Do you think they're going to be stopping white men, 18 to 35? No. And if they did, whoever stopped them would be fired summarily if they stopped the wrong rich white person. We know this. If they stopped everyone equally, irrespective of race or gender, but then what would be the point, right? It is tantamount to racial profiling, which is why stop and frisk doesn't work, because racial profiling doesn't work, and it has an extraordinarily negative consequence of traumatizing black and brown people. right? If you really believed in racially profiling and it wasn't just racist, then you would stop every young white man with blonde hair and blue eyes because they look like Timothy McVeigh.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, when you're looking at terrorist threats, you'd be stopping white people every single day, every minute. But that's not happening because of racism.
Yeah.
Because the face of violent crime in this country, because of media and other institutions, mainstream media and other institutions, is the face of a black man.
Yeah.
That's why stop and frisk can never work.
That's right. Well, Representative Rabb, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And I look forward to hearing this in 2 days.
Okay.
In 2 days.
Okay.
In 2 days.
I was muted there. We would like to thank Representative Chris Rabb for joining us on Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. So, Denise, we have, like I said at the top of the show, normally this time of year, in years past, there wouldn't be as much to discuss, but this year there certainly is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the first thing I want to ask you is touching on, I think, almost all the things we had discussed. And just to put it in perspective a little bit, it's July, it's the end of July. It'll be August next week. And, some people might be saying, why are we having a discussion about an election that's not going to happen until November of 2023? Well, the reality of it is we're going to know who's in this race in February, because that's when petitions are due. So you have to get signatures on petitions to be on the ballot, and that's going to be due in February. Everything that happens between now and February is really a prelude to what's going to happen then. The real election is going to be in May of next year. But getting to that point, a lot of things have to happen now for a lot of candidates. And what I mean by that is, lining up support, fundraising, developing your strategy. All those things matter. So we know that there are a lot of factors and a lot of different variables that go into a mayoral race in this city. But what do you think candidates have to do, particularly early, to be able to make an impact with voters?
Well, a lot of what they're going to be doing to impact voters or to get through to voters it's actually kind of connected to the midterm elections, which we have in November. I read an article in Billy Penn this morning as I was, getting ready to do what I do on a Wednesday. And it was talking about how Gen Xers and millennials, not Gen Xers and millennials, so Gen Zs and millennials. I can't tell the players without a scorecard. I'm technically a boomer, even though I wasn't even around for most of the baby boom. But younger people are saying we want a slice of the political pie. We want in on the Democratic City Committee. We want to have our voices heard. We want our issues talked about, and we want them to be reflected in policy. And they're starting to make some noise in that direction when it comes to the midterm elections, which, this was the group that, said, hey, I think John Fetterman should be the Democratic nominee. But they're going to make even more noise when it comes to the mayor's race. And it's already kind of starting where I like this person better than this person, or this person's progressive and this one's not progressive enough. And those things are going to rear their ugly heads. It starting with the midterms and going on until we get into formal mayoral season. And it for all intents and purposes, it started with the last city council meeting. But soon you will start getting invitations to fundraisers. You will suddenly see people out doing things that we don't normally see them do. You will suddenly see people making appearances that they don't normally make. Um, and it's all already starting to happen a little bit, but you have a younger group of people that's trying to push the agenda. And what's going to be interesting is to see how that actually impacts who becomes the mayor, who is going to appeal to this group of people.
Yeah, and that's again one of those variables that I hate to use this terminology because it came from one of the worst people ever. But when you're talking about the unknown known and the known unknown and all those things,
Mhm.
that is one of the what are the groups that you have to get support from in order to be successful. And it's interesting too because we've already seen those battle lines in local ward elections where insurgencies led by mostly younger people have gone up against stalwart um, ward leaders and longtime committee members with mixed results.
Mhm.
There are still issues stemming from what's happened in those areas. So like my ward is kind of split down the middle committee person wise. So it's interesting, right? So if you're depending on which candidate you are and who you think you appeal best to, no candidate I think would be able to get both sides of that divide in this ward, in my opinion. And I think there are
Mhm.
other wards like that. So it's very interesting. Um, and so you're going to be, if you're a candidate, one of the biggest questions you have to ask is who's my constituency in the primary? Who are the
And
people I'm
what do
speaking?
I have right? And what do I have to do to maintain that constituency?
Mhm. And that's another, sometimes when you're appealing to constituencies, you'll have, say, 90% of your agenda might line up, but the 10% that doesn't could be a major issue for you. And I think you're going to see that with some of the candidates who have been or people who have been mentioned as candidates.
Mhm.
So when we're if we're in almost August now, right? So that gives you August, September, October, November, December, January, and February. So we're
Mhm.
really about 6 months out from knowing who's going to be on the ballot.
Right.
If you're putting this campaign together, what are you doing right now?
Right now, first of all, money is the mother's milk of politics. Right now, I'm raising money because in order to get in front of the people that you need to get in front of to get endorsements like the unions, like Democratic City Committee, like, various community groups and stuff, in order to get in front of these people to get these endorsements, you need money. And money you means, trying to put together the kinds of fundraisers that won't get anybody in trouble with the ethics, the ethics committee. Um, and what people need to understand is that fundraising is going to be slightly different this mayoral cycle because everybody's afraid now. And I say that because basically the federal government, the Department of Justice, has pretty much decided that it's going to set up an outpost here in Philadelphia just to wait and see who messes up so that they can indict them. The federal government, the Department of Justice is not done with Philadelphia yet. And people need to, and there's a whole lot of people that are running for mayor or are thinking of running for mayor that really need to take this into consideration because Some of the people that they have used as funding sources in the past, one, are not available. While Local 98 is probably still contributing to candidates, it's not contributing at the levels that it did when John Doherty was running that union. Because Doherty would, if Doherty really liked you, he would throw a lot of money your way. If he didn't like you, he would throw a lot of money your opponent's way. And contrary to what everybody in city, what the more progressive minded folk in city council would like to tell you, everybody in Philadelphia politics has had some Local 98 money in their pocket at some point. But right now people are fundraising, or they're forming exploratory committees to find out whether they should bother getting in the race. And you also have people who are kind of shoring up their base of support. They're shoring up who they know is going to come out for them. They're shoring up their surefire funding sources. They're making plans if they have to resign to run and to be able to pay their rent and utilities and stuff while they're on the campaign trail. They're trying to figure out what other job they can do while they run. If you're a lawyer, you're kind of at an advantage here because most law firms, if you're a member of a law firm, if you're a partner, saying that they have a mayoral candidate, that's a legit mayoral candidate on their staff, that's bragging rights right there. So of course, you'll have to do some actual billable work, but you'll also have a lot of room to campaign while making a pretty decent check. And soon you'll also hear about the consultants who are going to be used this time around. And it's probably going to be a lot of the same names, like the Mark Nevinses of the world and folks like that. But that's what folks are trying, and that's what folks are trying to figure out now. Who do I get? How do I get my team together? What is that team going to look like? And what can I do to make sure that we have all of the resources we need to be successful?
So let's fast forward a little bit here. The first candidate announces they're running and they hold their first press conference.
Mm-hmm.
What does that person need to say? Or what issues do they need to touch on in that first press conference to be seen as a legitimate candidate or to show that they're in touch?
Well, gun violence is an obvious one. I mean, let's face it. There's no getting around gun violence. It's kind of been the issue for a while now, which is why we're having more discussions on stop and frisk. Do not be surprised if the phrase law and order comes out of somebody's mouth during that first press conference, because unlike 8 years ago when police reform was the phrase that everybody said because folks wanted to make themselves look like they were more willing to hold police accountable than their counterparts. That I don't want to say that ship has completely sailed, but the sails are billowing and the boat is starting to move. Because when the shooting incident happened on the Parkway during Welcome America, and the other shooting incident happened on South Street, that got too close to home for people who were able to ignore the city's gun violence issues because they were happening in places like North Philadelphia and West Philadelphia and Southwest Philadelphia. As long as it was happening in these areas that these people would never, ever spend any time in unless they were going to the airport or they had to, pick something up at Denise's Delicacies Bakery, folks were okay. they didn't worry about it much. But the minute it started to get to the places that gun violence started to happen in the places that tourists go to and that the city relies on for tourism revenue, especially with the World Cup on the way, then you started to see more of a shift toward law and order. I mean, the press conference that City Council President Darrell Clark had right after the incident on the Parkway, stop and frisk was one of the first things he said. And because that particular ruling is still on the books with the Supreme Court, as long as folks can say, oh, it's justified for me to do this stop and frisk, it's not going to matter that you're not doing it anywhere other than Black and Latino neighborhoods.
Do you think that the members of city council who are considered, viewed as potential candidates are going to have a disadvantage on this issue because they've been in office when this happened?
Well, more than likely, somebody who served in city council is going to be the next mayor. But you make a good point, Larry. The first question that I, as a voter, can ask a member of city council that's running for office is, you've been in city council X amount of years. What have you done about this problem? And the thing is, the city's gun violence issues did not get this way overnight. They're not going to get solved overnight. But one thing that the city has had a fairly intractable problem with is its poverty rate. And if you take, as DA Larry Krasner often says, if you take a map of the poorest sections of Philadelphia and you overlay that map with a section with a map that shows where all the gun violence, where most of the gun violence is going on, you find that it's the same map. And rather than dealing with the fact that poverty and housing insecurity and a school district that no matter what the Supreme Court says in Pennsylvania, because right now, and I don't know how many of our listeners have been following this, there is a lawsuit that is, and closing arguments were just had on it in Harrisburg, that addresses fair funding or the lack thereof for the Commonwealth schools. So no matter what happens there, and no matter what happens there, you have schools in Philadelphia that have been grotesquely underfunded. And because of that, you have like this perfect storm of poverty and a lack of education and stuff that leads to gun violence. And until we are willing to say, I understand that there are people out there who've done really bad things and they need to be locked up, but maybe if we stop disinvesting in communities and actually started doing something about that, we could, if we started to do something about that, then we could get gun violence could go away. Because as a activist in who handles gun violence issues told me a long time ago, the best program to stop gun violence is a job. Because if you have a job, you don't have time to go out and shoot people. And everybody knows this, but because it would require a whole lot more money to go to this problem than it does saying, okay, we're going to give community groups $185 million, but we're not going to necessarily show them how to use it in a way that allows them to expand their programs or make sure that this benefits the community. As long as, that's easier to say. And that's, as our mutual friend Vincent Thompson would put it, that's sexier to say. That's a sexy thing. And, maybe we need to get away, maybe the next mayor needs to get away from the sexy thing and, look at the long-term problem, because gun violence is a long-term problem.
So we have an idea of at least some of the people who are going to be in this race.
Mhm.
Do you see, and really anybody, think about anybody possible who could win this election and then be the mayor in 2024? Do you think that any of these candidates would be able to spur that change that is needed to begin to chip away at that poverty, which is them in turn chipping away at that gun violence issue? Because I tend to think that's what it takes. It takes a major shift in direction. And people could disagree with me on that, and I understand. There's a lot of different ways to have this conversation. But it seems to me that that's what's needed. And it's a lot easier to say things than to get in there and do it.
Mhm.
And I wonder if any of these candidates will have the right appetite for that.
It's going to depend on the makeup of council after 2023, because council is up for re-election too. And this is what people are predicting, if as many as 6 people resign to run, council is going to look a whole lot different.
Yeah.
And everybody's got a different approach. Like, say, for example, if council majority leader Sherelle Parker decides that she's going to run for mayor, her attitude towards certain things is different than, say, councilwoman at large Helen Gibbs, who is also being talked about as a candidate. For one thing, you would never hear the words stop and frisk as a positive thing come out of Helen Gibbs' mouth. Yet Sherelle Parker is kind of, marketing herself as someone who would be amenable to it.
Despite the fact that she
was the one that created the stop and frisk resolution that basically outlawed stop and frisk, which I'm like, it's one of those things where you sit there and you're like, you do remember that you did this, right? And you sometimes think that maybe people forgot. But there's a whole bunch, like Alan Dom. I don't know how well he could pull this off. I mean, because he talks about gun violence a lot, but I don't know what he's actually done about it. And with the exception of the earned income tax credit, he doesn't really talk about poverty all that much. If Derek Green does decide to run, I'm interested in seeing what he'll do, because he's a member of all of these really prestigious nationwide organizations that deal specifically with issues of cities. And which means he's picked up some things that he might think, oh, okay, well, that might work here. Forgetting, of course, that Philadelphia, the one section, there's a section of the coat of arms for Philadelphia that should read, that's the way we've always done it. Because I've never heard that phrase uttered so much in any city I have lived in. It's like, that's the way we've always done it is like the mantra of Philadelphia, despite the fact we are nearing insanity territory with some of the stuff that, we've always done this exact way. And for those of you who don't know what I mean by that, the definition of insanity is doing something the exact same way constantly and yet expecting a different result. And that's kind of where we are with a lot of things. So, Derek Green being a part of organizations that, are nationwide and getting exposed to that kind of thing, it might help, the city in the long run if you have people who will stop saying that's the way we've always done it.
And, you bring up an important point, because I don't think any of the candidates you mentioned can point directly to a piece of legislation and say and is meant to curb gun violence. It's not to say they haven't supported things. It's not to say they don't have a good idea. I'm not saying that at all. And to be quite honest about it, I think each and every one of them has legislation that touches on these issues, whether it be poverty, jobs, all different kinds of things. But that might be a little bit too far for the average voter to say, well, how did, the EITC awareness campaign equal eradicating gun violence, or how does the CLIP program do that? And I can, some people may not see it that way. And I think most of them would have a hard time being able to point and say, well, what about this? What about that? Which is why it makes it a little easier for an outsider candidate to take the high ground on the violence issue.
Like a Jeff Brown, who basically, if you've ever heard about like gun buyback programs, the folks at the Father's Day Rally Committee, Bilal Qayyum, and sometimes Councilman Kenyatta Johnson is involved in these, where people turn in their guns. Like, say you found a AK-47 just lying around your house, which I'm hoping no one does. And if you do, I hope you have a very large gun lock for it. But say you want to get it out of the house. You go to one of these gun buyback programs and you say, hey, I have this gun. I want to get it out of my house. Do you want it? And they take it from you, and in exchange, they give you a grocery gift card from, you guessed it, Brown ShopRite. So he can say, with no fear of contradiction, that he has been doing something to combat gun violence, because he basically has been allowing people to exchange their guns for groceries without being hassled by the cops. But I don't know, but as I often think of when it comes to business people being a part of government, business and government are two different animals. And if you don't know how one works, if you don't know how government works, this is probably not the gig for you. It's probably in your best interest to, continue to be a business person, because if you don't know how government works, there are enough people we have in government that don't know how government works. Philadelphia can't afford that.
Well, and that's the thing too, right? And not just government in general, but if you don't have any experience and you're trying to be mayor, that's
like being a baby and trying to beat Sydney McLaughlin in a 400-meter hurdles race. Now, for those of you who don't know who Sydney McLaughlin is, she is the current world record holder for the 400-millimeter hurdles, and it was her own record that she broke. She is that fast. She ran this race in under 51 seconds at leaping over things.
Yeah.
So, you make a good point. If you don't know if you've never been in government before, mayor is probably not the best office for you to start.
And that's sort of the track that Alan Dom took 8 years ago. He was said to be considering a run for mayor, but he ran for council first and served 2 terms. And, experience-wise, I think that makes it a big difference. But for voters too, they can say, well, he was there for 8 years and has government experience, which I think can't be overlooked. And I do get wary when I hear people say, well, we got to run government like a business. You can't. It's not the same thing at all. And we can talk more about that on subsequent shows, why that is. But it does create some concern. And I always, and I've said it on the show a couple times, I think, but I always think back to this quote that President Kennedy said early in his first term, or in his term. He said that the only problems I get are the ones nobody else could solve, because everything else is taken care of at a cabinet level position or something like that. It's the same thing with being mayor. You get the problems that nobody else could solve, and you need to understand how the system works in order to solve those problems. So we are going to have to leave it there, though. So we want to thank everybody for joining us. We'll be back next week.
Yes,
and,
I'll be joining you from Las Vegas at the
Yes.
NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists, National Association of Hispanic Journalists Joint Conference.
That's going to be great, and we're going to look forward to hearing about what's going on there next week. So for Denise and myself and Lance Haver, who's on special assignment this week, we will see you all next week on Hall Monitor.
Have a good night, everybody.